Hey all, do you feel like sometimes you're just less capable than everyone around you? Do you feel like maybe you shouldn't be in the role that you are and that maybe people are gonna find out and like kind of discover you as an imposter? Then you might have imposter syndrome. You just don't internalize your achievements and you feel like you can never achieve enough to really get that feeling of satisfaction. If this is you, if you kind of tend to be perfectionistic and you overwork, this is the video for you. I'm going to actually be starting a series on imposter syndrome, and this is the first video in this series. We will be going off of this workbook here, which I will link below, on imposter syndrome. And we will overcome your imposter syndrome one video at a time. We'll do an exercise each day, and you will learn how to kind of reconfigure your mind so that you can actually internalize your success, feel better, and make better decisions when it comes to work instead of kind of doing that whole cycle of overworking and crashing and just feeling bad. Like, imposter syndrome feels quite bad, and you do not need to feel this poorly. You can still succeed and feel great while doing it. So before we get started, I invite you to subscribe and like the video because there's a lot of people with imposter syndrome out there. Actually, research shows that 75% of people will feel imposter syndrome at one point in their lives. So what exactly is imposter syndrome? Imposter syndrome is feeling like a fraud all the time, really being incapable of seeing all of your accomplishments and living in fear that you will be found out at any moment. It is not a great feeling, and it can really prevent you from achieving everything that you could in life because sometimes people with imposter syndrome really play it small. They could be doing so much more. What's interesting is that oftentimes we think that people with imposter syndrome are not successful, but in reality, a lot of very successful people have imposter syndrome because imposter syndrome typically leads people to overachieve, to overwork, to do more, to do things more perfectly. And although this sounds all well and good, the issue is that they often do these things while feeling really, really bad about themselves. And at the same time, they typically have a non-sustainable work cycle. So essentially they will work, or they'll procrastinate, or they'll crash. And oftentimes they'll also sometimes self-sabotage. So at the very last minute when they just need to finish one more thing, they won't do it because they know that if they finish that one last thing, they'll be done, and then they will have to evaluate themselves and it might not be perfect. Okay, so let's go over here and go over the signs of imposter syndrome. And you might see this in yourself, so listen up. Okay, so are you high achieving? Do you always want to be the best? Do you attribute your success to luck, overwork, or a result of a relationship? Do you discount praise and feel guilty about your success? Do you feel like a failure and are afraid of being discovered as a fraud? Do you not feel intelligent when maybe you should? Do you have anxiety, self-esteem issues, and maybe depression? Are you perfectionistic? Do you overestimate others and underestimate yourself? Do you overwork? Do you never really feel successful? So you can actually assess your severity of imposter syndrome in an imposter syndrome survey. So this is an assessment that's been scientifically validated, and I will link this below, and you'll actually see, like, am I really high on imposter syndrome, or am I just maybe in the middle? Like, how bad is my imposter syndrome? Now we want to talk about, like, why do we do this? Like, why do we have imposter syndrome? It's actually really interesting, and it kind of exists in a cycle. It's a little bit of a reinforcing cycle that we do. So when you have imposter syndrome, you have a very low conceptualization of yourself. Like, you do not think that much of yourself, right? You might have low self-esteem. So what happens is that essentially you need to rely on others to signal to you that you are capable and that you are worthy. And you can actually receive some pleasure out of that. You can actually feel good when people think of you as worthy and capable. And because you are not able to do this for yourself, this is literally your only way of, like, getting that crumb of dopamine, of, like, feeling good. because inside your own head, you're kind of like barraging yourself with really negative self-talk. So what happens is that essentially you're barraging yourself with negative self-talk, but you see that there is a potential for you to succeed and to get the approval of someone else. Maybe it's a boss, manager, colleague, professor, etc., right? And so you overwork, you get all anxious, you strive really, really hard to achieve the success in order to get that approval. And then you get the approval and you feel better. And it's like, oh, thank God, like I can finally feel somewhat good, right? And so the cycle is completed, right? So essentially you felt quite bad, you did this thing, and then you felt good. And that's essentially a reinforcing behavior. Of course we would keep repeating this, right? The mind-boggling thing about imposter syndrome though is, and this is like matrix level mind-boggling, is that we wouldn't need to engage in this cycle if we didn't have such a low opinion of ourselves in the first place. So the reason that you engage in the cycle is because essentially your thoughts about yourself are so painful, they're so negative, that you need to do something to make yourself feel better, and that is seeking the external approval. And really your only way to feel good about yourself is to seek the external approval. So of course you've essentially taught yourself that if I feel bad, if I need to get like a good feeling about myself, I need to go do the things that would result in external approval and people approving of me. I mean, and you can kind of see like all of the issues with this, right? So essentially we can't control other people, like people can be fickle. We might think that we're gonna get approval, but that person doesn't express approval, and then we're extremely disappointed. Or maybe we don't do it quite as well as we thought we would, and we don't get that approval. And so it can be extremely painful to go through this cycle because it requires so much energy, like so much work. And you wouldn't really need to have to engage in the cycle at all if you actually focused on the root cause of the problem. And that is the low self-perception. That is the thinking that you are not enough, that you are not capable enough, that you are not intelligent enough, that there is something inherently missing. And that if you don't figure this out, then you could be exposed as a fraud. And if you can actually work on those thoughts, on actually maybe conceptualizing yourself as a capable, intelligent person, this cycle wouldn't be necessary. But I know that's a little bit of a big ask if you're kind of in the trenches of imposter syndrome. It can be really difficult to kind of see yourself in a different light, especially when you've been seeing yourself in this imposter syndrome light for decades, years, etc., right? So what I want you to understand is that you have thoughts that are helpful and thoughts that are harmful. And I know a lot of people want to conceptualize thoughts as true or untrue, but honestly, I think that's a fool's errand because it's actually really hard to define what's true and untrue. And also, I don't think that's very useful. So from now on, let's think of our thoughts as helpful or harmful. And your imposter syndrome thoughts are harmful. They are not helping you. They're essentially making you feel bad, and they're making you engage in these cycles that are not very productive. And so what we want to start doing is we want to start recognizing the imposter syndrome thoughts. Those thoughts are not you. Those thoughts are the imposter syndrome thoughts. And we're going to start figuring out which thoughts are the imposter syndrome thoughts so that we can kind of weed them out from our usual normal thoughts that are associated with ourselves and our personalities. So one way that I think is really helpful in kind of seeing which thought is an imposter syndrome thought and which thought is just, one of your normal everyday thoughts is to see how you feel. So imposter syndrome thoughts are going to make you feel awful. They're going to make you be filled with guilt, shame, fear, etc. So from now on, when you have your kind of usual day, you're going through your day and you all of a sudden feel like just horrible, think about what you are thinking. those are probably imposter syndrome thoughts. And I want you to recognize them and I want you to label them. Like, oh, hey, like think about like if you have like a label maker in your mind, you're going around and you're like, that's an imposter syndrome thought. I saw this woman on a YouTube video and she told me to label this and I am labeling it as my thought. And that is imposter syndrome right there. That is not me. That is something separate. That is my brain engaging in a pattern that I have established through fear. And I established this pattern because I was worried that I was not enough, that I wouldn't be able to accomplish the things that I wanted to accomplish. And that's so normal. It's so normal to have fear. And it is okay to have fear. But now we need to kind of retrain some of that fear because it's established a cycle that is really, really hurtful to you. And here you're going to start, and you're going to start by labeling those thoughts as imposter syndrome thoughts. And I want you to just start looking for them. And when you label a thought, you gain some distance from it and you realize that it's not inherent to yourself. You don't always have to think these thoughts. These are the imposter syndrome thoughts and they are not you. Okay? So I just want you to engage in this practice this week, and next week we will be back with another video on this series, and we'll work more on our imposter syndrome, and it'll help us achieve more and feel better while doing it. And who doesn't want that, right? Okay, so I will see you all next week, and I hope you have a wonderful week.